What happens when one of music's most fearless icons meets a talk show host who clearly doesn't know when to stop pushing? You won't believe what unfolds when Madonna sits down for what was supposed to be a simple promotional interview that turns into a career-defining disaster for Jimmy Fallon. This is the explosive confrontation that had millions of viewers glued to their screens and left the entertainment industry questioning professional boundaries. The Tonight Show studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy, but there was something different in the air last night. Madonna, the queen of pop, had arrived to promote her latest documentary project. And anyone familiar with her reputation knows that interviews with her can take unexpected turns. What nobody anticipated was how quickly things would spiral out of control. From the moment Madonna walked onto the set, seasoned crew members noticed something was off. She moved with her characteristic confidence, but there was tension in her shoulders, sharpness in her eyes that suggested she wasn't in the mood for Fallon's typical light-hearted banter. The audience gave her the warm reception she deserved, but as she settled into the guest chair, the atmosphere felt charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with excitement. Fallon opened with his standard, enthusiastic greeting. A familiar, wide smile plastered across his face as he launched into what should have been harmless small talk. Madonna, the legend herself, thank you so much for being here tonight. You look absolutely incredible, as always. His voice carried that slightly manic energy longtime viewers know well. But something in his tone immediately put Madonna on edge. Thank you, Jimmy, she replied, her voice measured and controlled. But anyone watching closely could see the slight tightening around her eyes. She adjusted her position in the chair, subtle gesture that body language experts would later note as defensive positioning. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Fallon asked about her documentary, and Madonna gave thoughtful, articulate responses about her creative process and the themes she wanted to explore. But even during these seemingly innocent exchanges, micro moments of friction hinted at the storm brewing beneath the surface. So tell us about this new project, Fallon continued, leaning forward with exaggerated interest. I have to say, you've been pretty quiet lately. Are you trying to stay out of trouble? The question came with his trademark laugh, but the implication hung in the air. Madonna's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Quiet. I think you had me confused with someone else. Jimmy, I've been working constantly, creating art, pushing boundaries, doing what I've always done. Good. Her voice remained steady, but a new edge made the studio audience shift uncomfortably. Right. Of course. Fallon backpedaled, but immediately doubled down in a way that would prove to be his undoing. But you have to admit, the whole social media thing has been pretty wild lately. Some of those posts, he trailed off with a knowing look, expecting her to laugh along. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Madonna's posture straightened, and for a moment, the only sound was the barely audible hum of the studio lights. Which posts would those be, Jimmy? Her voice was silk wrapped around steel, a tone anyone familiar with her career would recognize as a warning. Fallon, seemingly oblivious to the danger he was walking into, pressed forward with the confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged on his own show. You know, just some of the more provocative ones. The bathroom selfies, the whole thing with the Instagram filters. People were talking about it. His laugh sounded forced, and several crew members exchanged worried glances. People were talking about it, Madonna repeated slowly, as if tasting each word. And what exactly were people saying, Jimmy? What was so important about these conversations that you felt the need to bring them up on national television? The audience could sense the shift. What had started as typical late-night chatter was turning into something much more serious and uncomfortable. Fallon's writers had likely prepared him for standard promotional questions, maybe a funny anecdote or two, but this was rapidly becoming something else entirely. I mean, it's just, you know, how the internet gets, Fallon stammered, his usual smooth delivery beginning to crack under pressure. People have opinions about everything these days. I just thought it was interesting how you've been so visible lately." The word visible hung in the air like an accusation. Madonna's expression didn't change, but anyone watching could see the storm building behind her eyes. She had been in the entertainment industry for over 4 decades, had faced criticism, praise, controversy, and acclaim with equal measure. But there was something about Fallon's approach that was hitting different nerves. "Visible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the studio. "Jimmy, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying here. Are you suggesting that my presence on social media is somehow inappropriate for a woman of my age?" The question cut through the studio like a blade. This wasn't the playful back and forth that Tonight Show viewers were accustomed to. This was a direct challenge, and everyone present knew that Fallon's next words would determine whether this interview could be salvaged or whether they were about to witness something unprecedented in late-night television history. Fallon's face flushed red as he realized he had stepped into quicksand, but instead of backing away gracefully, he seemed determined to dig himself deeper. No, that's not what I meant at all. I just think, well, there's a certain way that people expect." He gestured vaguely, as if the air itself could provide him with the words he needed to escape the hole he was digging. But Madonna wasn't going to let him off that easily. She had built her career on refusing to be silenced, on challenging expectations, on demanding respect rather than simply hoping for it. And right now, sitting across from a man who seemed determined to reduce her to tabloid fodder, all of that fighting spirit was coming to the surface. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as the two stared at each other across the small table that suddenly felt like a chasm. The audience held their collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. In the control room, producers frantically whispered to each other, unsure whether to go to commercial or let this unprecedented moment play out. What happened next would change everything. But that confrontation was still building, still gathering momentum, like a storm that hadn't yet unleashed its full fury. The real explosion was still coming, and when it arrived, it would leave both careers fundamentally altered. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but it was probably only 10 seconds of dead air that felt like a lifetime in television terms. Fallon's nervous energy was becoming palpable as he fidgeted with his note cards, clearly searching for a way to redirect the conversation back to safer ground. But Madonna wasn't about to let him escape that easily. She had heard these subtle digs before, had faced this kind of barely concealed ageism and sexism countless times throughout her career. And tonight, something inside her had reached a breaking point. "Jimmy," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Let me ask you something. When was the last time you questioned a male artist about being too visible on social media? When was the last time you suggested that a man in his 60s should maybe tone down his online presence because people were talking about it?" The question landed like a physical blow. Fallon's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make things worse. In the audience, you could hear individual members shifting in their seats, the collective intake of breath as everyone realized they were witnessing something far beyond typical late-night entertainment. It's different," Fallon stammered. And even as the words left his mouth, everyone in the studio knew he was making a catastrophic mistake. The phrase, "it's different," when discussing gender dynamics, was like throwing gasoline on an already dangerous fire. Madonna's eyebrows raised with a kind of expression that had intimidated record executives and industry power players for decades. "Different? How, exactly? Please enlighten all of us about how it's different when a woman expresses herself versus when a man does the same thing." The control room was in absolute chaos now. Producers were frantically debating whether to cut to commercial. But this was live television, and the train wreck was happening in real time. Social media was already exploding with clips and commentary. Even though the full confrontation hadn't even reached its peak yet, Fallon tried to laugh it off, that nervous giggle that had become his trademark. But it sounded hollow and desperate in the charged atmosphere. "Madonna, come on. You know, that's not what I meant. I'm a huge fan. I've always been a huge fan. I just think sometimes the media takes things and blows them out of proportion. And maybe what, Jimmy?" Madonna interrupted, her voice rising slightly for the first time since the interview began. "Maybe I should be more careful about how I present myself. Maybe I should consider what other people think before I post a photo of myself. Maybe I should act my age." The last three words hung in the air like an accusation, and everyone present knew that this was the moment everything changed. This wasn't just about social media posts or public perception anymore. This was about decades of women being told to diminish themselves, to make themselves smaller, to consider everyone else's comfort before their own authentic expression. Fallon's face went completely pale as he realized the magnitude of what was happening. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. You're putting words in my mouth. I would never suggest that you should act your age, because honestly, age is just a number, and you look incredible." "Stop," Madonna said firmly, holding up her hand. The single word carried such authority that Fallon immediately fell silent. "Just stop talking, Kimmy. Every word you say is making this worse. Do you realize what you just did? Do you understand that you just told a room full of people and millions of viewers that there's something wrong with how I choose to express myself?" The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a masterclass in standing up for yourself, delivered by one of the most powerful women in entertainment history. But it was also a career suicide for a talk show host who had built his brand on being universally likable and non-controversial. "I never said there was anything wrong," Fallon started. But Madonna cut him off again. "You implied it. Jimmy, you brought up my social media presence in a way that suggested it was problematic. You used words like provocative and visible as if they were criticisms. You laughed about bathroom selfies as if there was something inherently shameful about a woman being comfortable with her own body." Her voice was steady, but there was fire behind every word. The camera operators were capturing every micro-expression, every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. Fallon looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, while Madonna sat tall, commanding every inch. The icon who had refused to be silenced for over 4 decades. "In the worst part," Madonna continued, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper again, "is that you thought you could do this because you assumed I would just sit here and take it. You thought that because this is your show in your domain, you could make these little comments and I would laugh along like a good sport. Well, I'm not a good sport when it comes to sexism, Jimmy. I never have been, and I never will be." Fallon's team was probably screaming in his earpiece at this point, but he seemed frozen, unable to find any words that wouldn't make the situation exponentially worse. His usual charm and deflection tactics were useless against someone who had spent her entire career facing critics and emerging victorious. "You want to know what's really provocative, Jimmy?" Madonna asked, leaning forward slightly. "What's provocative is a 60-some-year-old woman refusing to disappear. What's provocative is continuing to create, to express myself, to take up space in a world that would prefer I quietly fade away. What's provocative is sitting here right now calling you out for your behavior instead of politely changing the subject." The tension in the studio reached a breaking point. You could feel it in the air, see it on the faces of the crew, hear it in the complete silence from an audience that had come expecting laughs and instead found themselves witnessing a cultural moment that would be dissected and analyzed for months to come. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of what would become the most talked about late-night television moment in years. The real explosion was still building, and when it finally erupted, it would leave everyone involved forever changed. Fallon made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation, and it was exactly the wrong move at exactly the wrong moment. Madonna, look, I think maybe we're both getting a little heated here. Why don't we take a step back and remember that we're all friends here? This is supposed to be fun, right? Maybe we should just agree to disagree and move on to talking about your new project. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. The suggestion that she was being heated while he was somehow the voice of reason. The implication that her legitimate concerns about sexism and ageism were just something to agree to disagree about. The patronizing tone suggesting she should calm down and get back to promoting her work like a good little guest. Madonna's expression shifted into something that anyone who had followed her career would recognize as absolutely lethal. This was the look she'd given record executives who tried to control her image, music critics who dismissed her artistic evolution, and countless men who had underestimated her throughout her decades-long career. Friends, she repeated, her voice dripping with disbelief. Jimmy, friends don't ambush each other with thinly veiled ageist comments on national television. Friends don't suggest that someone should be ashamed of their own body or their own self-expression. And friends certainly don't tell someone they're being heated when they're defending themselves against discrimination. She stood up abruptly, and a sudden movement sent a shockwave through the studio. This wasn't part of the show format. Guests didn't just stand up in the middle of interviews. The camera operators scrambled to adjust their shots, and you could hear the barely audible panic in the control room as producers tried to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. You know what, Jimmy? Madonna continued, now towering over him as he remained seated, looking smaller and more vulnerable by the second. I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've dealt with sexism, ageism, and every other kind of discrimination you can imagine. I've been criticized for being too sexual, too political, too outspoken, too everything. But I have never, not once, sat quietly while someone tried to shame me for being exactly who I am. The audience was completely transfixed. Some people had their phones out trying to capture this moment, while others just sat in stunned silence. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a cultural reckoning happening in real time. Fallon tried one more time to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation. Madonna, please. I think there's been a misunderstanding. If you could just sit back down, we could work this out. There's no misunderstanding, Jimmy. Madonna shot back, her voice cutting through his pleading like a sword. You made your position crystal clear. You think there's something wrong with how I present myself? You think I should be more appropriate for my age? You think I should care more about what other people think than about my own artistic expression? Well, let me make my position crystal clear. She stepped closer to his desk, and Fallon actually recoiled slightly in his chair. The power dynamic had completely reversed. This was Madonna's stage now, and everyone present knew it. I didn't survive for decades in this industry by worrying about what people like you think about my choices. I didn't become one of the most successful artists of all time by dimming my light to make others comfortable. And I sure as hell didn't agree to come on your show tonight to be lectured about how I should behave by someone who clearly doesn't understand the first. Think about what it means to be a woman in this business. Voice had risen now to a shout, but to a level of intensity that commanded absolute attention. Every person in that studio was hanging on her every word, witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. You want to know what's really inappropriate, Jimmy? What's inappropriate is using your platform to perpetuate the same tired stereotypes that have been used to silence women for generations. What's inappropriate is disguising your sexism as concern or humor. What's inappropriate is thinking that because this is your show, you can say whatever you want without consequences. Fallon was completely frozen now, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his note cards. He had no response, no comeback, no way to recover from this systematic dismantling of his behavior and his character. Madonna took a step back and straightened her outfit with the kind of dignity that only comes from decades of refusing to be diminished. Came here tonight to talk about my work, my art, my passion projects. Instead, I had to spend my time defending my basic right to exist as a fully realized human being. That's not my job, Jimmy. That's not what I signed up for. She turned toward the audience, acknowledging them directly for the first time since the confrontation began. To everyone watching at home, remember this moment. Remember that you never have to accept disrespect, no matter how it's packaged. Remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's comfort levels. And remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in your own diminishment. The applause started slowly, with just a few people clapping, but it quickly built into something thunderous. The audience was giving her a standing ovation, not for entertainment, but for courage, for refusing to back down, for showing them what it looks like to stand up for yourself with grace and power. Madonna nodded once to the audience, then turned back to Fallon one final time. This interview is over. Jimmy, I hope you learned something tonight. But honestly, I'm not optimistic. And with that, she walked off the stage, not running, not storming off in anger, but walking with the measured pace of someone who had said exactly what needed to be said, and was now choosing to remove herself from a situation that no longer deserved her presence. The studio fell into chaos as she disappeared backstage. Fallon sat frozen at his desk, clearly unsure whether to try to continue the show or cut to commercial. The audience was still applauding, many now on their feet, showing their support for what they had just witnessed. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across social media like wildfire. #MadonnaFallon began trending worldwide, with overwhelming support for Madonna's stance and harsh criticism of Fallon's behavior. Entertainment industry insiders were already calling it a career-defining moment for both parties involved. But in very different ways. The incident sparked widespread discussion about ageism and sexism in media, with countless women sharing their own experiences of being diminished or dismissed. Fallon's ratings plummeted in the following weeks as sponsors distanced themselves and viewers expressed their displeasure with his conduct. Questions about his future as a host began circulating. Almost immediately, Madonna was praised for her courage and authenticity. Her documentary project received renewed attention, and her social media following grew exponentially as people rallied behind her message of refusing to be silenced or diminished. The confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would be felt for much longer. It became a watershed moment about respect, dignity, and the power of refusing to accept unacceptable behavior, no matter how it's disguised or what stage it happens on.